Hello, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a couple of minutes. I just want to give a chance for everybody to get on and get connected. Please go ahead and type any questions that you might have in the comment box. I'll go ahead and address those before we start the new material, and we're going to talk about a couple of things that we have coming up. So hang tight for just a minute, and we'll get started at about 2:03. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It looks like we have most of our usual people on. So last week we covered chapters 6 and 7. This week we're going to be covering chapters 8 and 9. If you go ahead and take a look in the week 4 folder, remember if you can't see this folder, make sure that you've hit mark reviewed on your other folders to go ahead and open that up. But we'll have chapters 8 and 9 this week, and then our second exam that will cover chapters 6 through 9. Now the second exam is very similar to the first exam that you've already taken. The only difference is there's one short answer question, and I just want to emphasize again on short. So as long as you just kind of do your best and get close to the mark, you'll go ahead and get full points for that. There is a review for this exam that's posted. I'm going to make this window a little bit bigger so you can see this a little better. But there is an exam review. I'll post the lecture video today and of course Thursday after we cover it. And then your second exam is available for you to take. Now remember, in Inquisitive, if you complete chapter 8, I will give you participation at 100 for chapter 9. So just kind of keep that in mind. And I think that that's all of the Blackboard stuff that I wanted to talk about with you. Just another reminder, don't forget that on this discussion board tab that you do have your participation article that you'll need to get done just sometime before the end of this semester. The sooner the better. It's a really simple assignment. It shouldn't take a lot of your time, but please go ahead and start working on those. We do have one person that has already done it, but whenever you have time, just get in there and go ahead and get that done. Another thing I wanted to kind of check in on is because this is the midpoint, like we talked about a little bit last week, I will be sending out an announcement that will also come as an email to you, just to kind of check in and make sure that you guys are doing okay. If you'll just go ahead and respond to my email, let me know if everything's good, if there's anything that you need help with. It doesn't have to be very long. I just want to kind of reach out and make sure that everyone in here is doing the best that we can right now, and that everything is all right and you don't need anything from me. There's always this questions and answers forum if you have any kind of general questions or just chapter questions, anything like that. definitely feel free to put it in there. And then the last thing before we go ahead and move on into our new chapter is registration is currently open for summer and fall classes. I know they have announced officially that the first summer one session, which I believe is from May until about mid or the end of June, is going to also be technology based. But again, you guys are doing so well in this class that I definitely think all of you would be really successful in any of these courses. So if you do have any questions about registration or you need any help or anything like that, please go ahead and reach out and send me an email. I can help connect you to the right person to get you registered. And those spots are kind of filling up fast, so make sure that you do that. I do believe that there are accounting and also macro and microeconomics courses offered. Obviously, you guys won't need macro because you're doing a good job in here. But if you are needing to take microeconomics or you are needing to take Accounting Principles 1, I am offering a course in those this summer that will be very similar to how we're currently doing this course. So if you are interested in that or you have any questions about other classes, please go ahead and send me an email or a text and I'll get you fixed up. So now that we've kind of covered all of that, let's go ahead and move to our chapter for this week. All right, so chapter 8 is all about the price level and inflation. This is a pretty interesting chapter and again, very relevant to what's going on right now. So the last chapter that we talked about, chapter 7, talked all about unemployment. So we learned what the unemployment rate was. This was just the percentage of the labor force that would like to work and are currently searching for work but are unemployed. We talked about the labor force participation rate. There's a small typo in this slide. This should say labor force. But that was the percent of the overall population that was in the labor force. And we talked about how we can use this as kind of an additional market indicator. We also talked about what, the unemployment rate doesn't cover, and that's kind of people that have just become disgruntled and gave up on looking for work, or people that are underemployed. So remember, that was when you're, you have a job, but it's not necessarily your field or the amount of hours that you would like to have. And then we also talked about the 3 different types of unemployment. So remember, there was structural, cyclical, and frictional. And remember, frictional unemployment was the bad kind. So just keep that in mind. But make sure that you kind of understand, structural comes from technology advances, cyclical comes from changes in the business cycle, and then frictional was the kind that we didn't really know how long it would last. And it was kind of a negative, or actually it is a negative indicator that something is not right. So you guys answered a lot of great questions and had a lot of good discussions. So I'm not really worried about chapter 7. I know you guys really kind of understood that one. So thank you again for participating so much last week. Our big questions for today that I want you to keep in mind and be thinking about, the things that you need to be able to answer. 1 is, how do we measure inflation? 2 is going to be, what kind of problems come from inflation? And then 3 is, what is the cause of inflation? So those are just kind of general questions, but we will cover all of that this week and a little more. So inflation, let me go ahead and pop this slide up so that we can look at it. What is inflation? It's basically a continual rise in the general price level, which is just the price of all goods. It's not the price of a certain good going up due to a shift in demand or supply, because this is like a lot more widespread. So by itself, inflation will decrease the purchasing power of your dollars. What that means is that as inflation increases, the money that you currently have has less buying power, or it's worth less, and you can't really go out and get as much stuff with that money. Inflation also creates uncertainty. This is a problem both for firms and workers, and it can also cause consumers to change their buying patterns because of this uncertainty. So deflation, this is the opposite of inflation, and this is when the price level actually falls and there's a negative percentage change in the price level. Deflation is a lot less common than inflation. Deflation is something that could certainly happen, right now with like the current state of the economy and things like that. It's really far too early to know if that's true, but this chapter really is just focused on inflation. And again, the slide just kind of says, why is this problematic? Well, it's because it causes uncertainty, and also it makes it difficult to come up with long-term wages and contracts. Now, when they say long-term wages and contracts, they're talking about when you go out and you're applying for jobs and you're trying to kind of negotiate what your salary should be and how much money you should make and things like that. You don't exactly know what inflation will be whenever you're kind of sitting down and making these agreements. So it's a little bit hard to, as a consumer, come up with a wage that you feel is fair and sustainable. But it's also hard for firms to put out a number that they believe will keep up with inflation and things like that. And we'll talk about why inflation is a reason that it's important that you're kind of constantly, every year or couple of years, renegotiating your current wages and contracts and things like that. Because if you're not adjusting for inflation with your wages, even when you do get a raise, you might not actually be moving past what the inflation increase has been. So we'll cover that a little bit more as we move through the chapter, but just something to think about as we get started. So the Consumer Price Index is also a really important part of this chapter. What the Consumer Price Index is, the purpose of it is to include everything that's purchased by a typical consumer to give us an estimation of the cost of living. So what this index does is it uses a typical consumer. So we try to find what the average consumer buys. Obviously, people don't buy all of the same goods. College students, senior citizens, young parents, all of these people might buy different goods. But the goal here is to find kind of an average basket of goods and then assign a price of what that would cost the average consumer. Applying this weight on prices means that some price changes affect consumers more than others. So an example here is if the price of housing goes up by 20%, that would be a very harsh adjustment for families. Housing is the largest percentage of the Consumer Price Index. So because it's such a big part of the index, a significant increase in that, housing price would be very detrimental to consumers. Now, on the other hand, if the price of popcorn went up 20%, this wouldn't really be very bad because popcorn obviously would be a very small percentage of that Consumer Price Index. The GDP and GDP deflator, these measures that we talked about before, they're really too broad to use here because these items use goods and services that the average consumer really doesn't buy. So think things like tractors and wind turbines, right? These are going to be included in GDP and GDP deflator. But, you and me, the average consumer, we're not really going out unless you own a farm specifically and buying like a tractor or a wind turbine. And that's why we use this Consumer Price Index. We'll go into a lot more detail about what the CPI is and kind of how we calculate that here in a minute. But this index is calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that's just a government agency that reports inflation and unemployment data, and they also determine what kind of weight we're going to put on these various consumer goods. This graph is figure 8.1 from your book, and what it's showing here is inflation in the United States, and it's telling us that from 1965 up to 2015, inflation rates in the US have averaged 4%. This number is high because of excessive inflation in the 70s. So in the 70s, back here, you can see that we had some pretty significant jumps in inflation, and that kind of made our average inflation a little high. Inflation peaked at over 14% in 1980. So this high point, this peak right here, is when inflation was the highest. Recently, obviously before what's going on now, inflation rates have averaged less than 3%. This is going to change, obviously, in the coming months and years, but again, a little early to tell what exactly is going to happen here. Now, as we've seen with many of these graphs, do you guys remember what these shaded areas represent? I'll go ahead and tell you so you don't have to wait a really long time, but remember the shaded areas are marking recessions. So it'll be interesting that in a couple years when people are looking at their economics textbooks and going over these graphs, there's definitely going to be a shaded area in our current time period. We just don't know if it's going to be a very small shaded area or a very large shaded area to represent that there was a recession going on. Jessica, very good. I see that you typed in recession there. That's exactly right. It represents a recession. So great job. We are going to skip this clip as we usually do, but again, if you want it, go ahead and email me. I'll find the link and send it to you. Here's a practice what you know for you guys. Which of the following spending categories is the largest portion of the consumer price index basket? So I'll give you a second to answer that, and then we'll talk about it. You guys are wonderful and so quick, and this makes me feel really good that you're actually listening to me. So housing is the largest portion of the CPI market basket. The reason being, housing is typically the most expensive thing that a typical consumer will purchase. So this being such an expensive item, it is a very large part of the consumer price index, and changes to that housing market will again greatly affect the average consumer. Just a little fun fact for you. People often spend about 42% or more of their income on rent or mortgage payments. So this is probably something you guys are very familiar with, whether it's yourself paying it or your parents, or you're sharing it with that responsibility with other people. 42% of more of your income typically will go to rent or mortgage. For a lot of people, that's actually more. It will be more than 42%, but on average, across the entire United States, about 42% of your income going to rent or mortgage is very typical. So great job, you guys. I really appreciate you answering those. Now, this graphic is figure 8.2. This is really good to keep with you for your exam and when you're working on your assignments. This is showing you what prices are included in the CPI. So what makes up this consumer price index? If you think about the general types of expenditures that you make, this should probably line up kind of with what is on this graphic right here. So clearly housing, which is rent or mortgage, is the biggest portion of the average consumer's expenditure. And inside these different categories, there's going to be very specific prices. So for example, if we're over here in this kind of pea green triangle, that's food and beverages, which are 15% of the CPI. This is going to include prices for everything from potato chips to oranges to flour. So this is like any consumable food or beverage that you're buying is included here. These larger kind of generic categories are just to kind of capture the entire area, but the categories themselves do include very specific things. The weights that are assigned to the different categories are based on spending patterns of the typical American. So for example, a typical American is going to spend 16% of their overall expenditures on transportation. So that's down here in this orange triangle at the bottom, and 42% on housing. So what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does is they go out and they survey tons of people over like a couple of years. And then after conducting these surveys, they're able to come up with kind of this CPI measure and get an idea of what the average American spending is like. Obviously, that's much easier today to kind of track and calculate than it was in the past. So this measure is actually a pretty good measure to use. If you were ever doing, a study or things like that, the CPI is a very reputable measure that's a little more specific and pointed than just the general GDP or GDP deflator. Now, computing the CPI, every single month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects price information. I'm going to go ahead and pop this up. Basically, it's on over 8,000 goods and services in 211 different categories from 38 geographic locations. So categories can include food, clothing, entertainment, travel, housing, any of these things. Geographic locations are included to account for cost of living differences. So think of, cost of living is very different between the East Coast, the Midwest, the West Coast, rural, urban areas. These are all different. So they collect data in all of these different areas so that they can kind of pinpoint an average rather than just going off very expensive cost of living areas versus very cheap. The BLS also has to estimate how much each good is going to impact the typical consumer budget. So on the next slide, we'll use 3 different goods to kind of estimate CPI and give you an example. And the 3 goods that we're going to use on this example are going to be popcorn, Coke, and movie tickets. So a very obviously simplified model of the CPI, but you'll get the idea from the example. So calculating a simple price index, we want to consider the 3 goods, each given a price and quantity. So cost in this case is going to be the total amount of money expected to spend on this item. So the base year here is going to be 2016. That's on this left-hand side. And we can see we have our quantities on the far left. We have our unit prices in 2016, our total cost in 2016, which is just taking that quantity times the price. Then we have our new year, which is going to be 2017 in this example. And we're taking our unit prices and getting our total costs. And again, they're taking this unit price times this quantity. So that's where they're getting these total cost numbers. And you can see just before we really get in that the basket price in 2016 is $40. The basket price in 2017 is $44. And when they say basket, that's just the total of all the goods that are included in our index. In this case, that's popcorn, Coke, and movie tickets. Yeah, basket price is just another word for total. Perfect. Now, in the next year, 2017, we're purchasing the same goods that we purchased in 2016, but we're looking at the differences in price. To create an index, we have to use our base year, and we give it an index of 100 as a figure to compare other years to. So over here, you can see we're creating our index, this index EPI on the bottom. And in 2016, because we've determined it to be our base year, we just take our base year total price divided by our base year total price times 100. Obviously, your index year, this index EPI is always going to be 100 because that is your base year. It's 100%, right? Now, whenever we move to the coming years, like 2017, the new year, we want to adjust 2017 to see how much of that base year it is. So we take the basket price of the new year, so this $44, which was the new basket price in 2017. We divide that by the basket price in the base year. So the base year is always going to be on the bottom here whenever we're trying to calculate these indexes. Then we multiply that times 100 and we get 110. Now, whenever we multiply by 100 here, this is not converting the number to a percentage. It's just indexing the price level. And that's just kind of a fancy way of saying that we're basing everything off of 100 and we're creating an index. With steady inflation, all indices before our base year should be less than 100, and all indices after our base year should be greater than 100. So that's kind of if we were continuing with normal inflation. Now, there's more on this example on the next slide, so I am going to go ahead and move to the next one. And we will look at kind of the formulas and how they got there. So whenever we're calculating a price index, we take our price index is equal to the basket price divided by the basket price in the base year times 100. On the previous slide, that was the math under the year 2017. Using these price levels, we can go ahead and find inflation with a percentage change formula. Inflation rises are going to be inflation rates and rises are going to be measured annually because we need a whole year to really get a good answer. And once we've calculated those two price indices from the previous slide, we can use this formula to calculate our inflation rate. So what's happening here is they took the new index number minus the old index number divided by that old base year index number times 100. In this case, we are converting this index to a percentage, and you can see that inflation was 10%. So that was the inflation rate from 2016 to 2017. So just kind of note here, the price index formula necessitates that the price level in the base year is equal to 100. The ratio of basket price to basket price in the base year is also always going to be equal to 1. So I'm going to go back to the previous slide now that we've seen the math here, just to kind of show you what's happening again to make sure that we understand this because it is really important. So what they're saying here is because 2016 is our base year, this basket price divided by basket price in your base year will always be 1 because you're just taking 40 divided by 40. It's always going to equal 100 when we're calculating this index formula in your base year because your base year is kind of your metric 100. Now in 2017, they just took the new price, which is just this total with 2017 prices, divided by that base year basket price, which was this $40, multiply it by 100 to turn it to an index, and then we got 110. Now we have our base year number of 100 for the index, our new year of 2017 index, that's 110. Then they plug that into this percentage change formula, which is just new year minus base year divided by base year times 100. That gives us a percentage and a 10% increase in inflation. If this number is positive, that means that inflation happened. We had an increase of inflation of 10%. If you happen to get a negative number right here, that means that deflation occurred. So if it's a negative number, you can say that deflation occurred at a rate of, 1% if it was -1 or something along those lines. So price index alone really doesn't provide us with a ton of information. So that's this number right here, the 100 versus 110. But turning it into an inflation rate does give us a little more information. And the math here is not really difficult. It's just a matter of putting things in the right place. So I definitely go ahead and mark this slide and that last slide and, kind of use those as you're working through your problems to get familiar with this process. What we can do is we can compare price level increases and decreases from the base year without any additional information. But the index is really only going to be meaningful for comparisons between years. And we are going to need at least 2 values for that price index. So this by itself, not great. The inflation rate is where we really start to get a little bit more information. This is figure 8.4, and this is just kind of showing us CPI and inflation over the long run. So CPI, which is Consumer Price Index, again, this is going to measure the cost of a typical consumer's basket of goods over time. In the figure on this slide, the index is set to 100 in 1982 to 84, so that's the base year. So right in here, this is the base year that we're using. The inflation rate, this is the percentage change in the CPI from one year to the next. The higher the inflation rate, the greater the rate of the CPI increases. So the CPI and inflation, you can see that as inflation goes up, that's going to cause the price of the consumer goods or the consumer price index to go up as well. Some just observations here that you can kind of gather from this. The average of inflation for the US is typically about 4%. During the last 50 years, inflation was highest around the decade of the 1970s. So around, this kind of area, we had our highest inflation peaks. And then since 1983, inflation has averaged less than 3%. Inflation rates were negative only during the recession of 2008 and 2009, and briefly in 2015. So you can see here, whenever it dips below this kind of baseline 0, that's when we're having deflation. And this is something that we'll likely observe in the coming years, as a result of the current pandemic and the economy not doing as well as it could be. So that'll be something that will happen likely and we'll recover from, obviously. It'll just take a little while. Now, another thing that's kind of important to remember is that prices aren't going to move all together at the same time. So I'm going to pop this slide up and then we'll talk about it. Now, most prices are going to rise over time. We know that, right? Travel gets more expensive, education gets more expensive, healthcare gets more expensive, all of these things. But some prices go down over time. So these are things like consumer electronics, and this is typically due to technological advancement. The example that they give here is in 1997, a tube TV would cost you about $7,000. And in 2012, a flat panel or flat screen TV was about $500. You could get one for that price. The best example of a good that has prices that fall over time is going to be technology. The reason being, initial prices for technological advancements are going to be high, and they tend to fall as the technology improves. So let's think about that. Obviously, there's some exceptions here, like, iPhones, MacBooks, things like that, that just tend to get like more and more and more expensive. But what are some things that you can think about that used to be really expensive to buy technology-wise, but now you can buy that same thing for relatively cheaper? So I'll give you all guys a second to think about that, but go ahead and just type in the comment box, like, what's something that you can buy today, technology-wise, that is cheaper than it was in the past? Drones, very good. Drones used to not be something that the common, lay person could go out and buy. They were really kind of restricted for like military and commercial use because they were so expensive in advance. Now you can go out and buy like a tiny drone for a very reasonable price. Jessica said flat screen TVs. That's also very true. Now, much like with iPhones and MacBooks, you can buy very expensive TVs that continue to get more expensive, but you can also buy a pretty generic flat screen TV for a much lower price. So another example that your book gives is computers. In 1980s, computer operating discussions were all about megabytes and megahertz. During this time, it cost about $3,000 to $5,000 to buy a computer, if not more. Today, we have terabytes and gigahertz, and the best computers are around like 2,500. So the quality of computers has increased, but the price has decreased. This is a really unique phenomenon in general, because typically most prices will rise over time, but technology is an exception. Teresa said cameras. So also said cameras. So yeah, that's a really big, we used to have just like the point and shoot, like film cameras that you had to roll and go get the film processed and things like that. And now pretty much every cell phone has a, really decent camera, and you can go out and buy an actual camera for a lot cheaper. It's not such a luxury item that it was in the past. So all very good examples. So thank you guys for that. Here's a practice what you know. If inflation is a general rise in the price level, why have consumer electronic prices fallen over time? So I'll give you guys a second to answer that. You guys are so quick and also very accurate. So increases in technology have greatly reduced production costs for these goods. So that's why those technology prices are going down. Increases in technology are going to shift the supply curve rightward. So remember when we talked about those curves and how they jump completely over to the right? And that was just according to the standard micro theory that we've talked about, that whenever it becomes cheaper and easier to produce these goods, it greatly reduces the overall price that consumers will pay as well. So wonderful job. You guys are doing great as usual. This is table 8.1, and this is showing you historical food prices. So price levels for the years are shown in the table in the conversion column. They've actually already adjusted these price levels for you in 2015 dollars. So the price level in 2015 was $2.35. So that's kind of our base year, and you can see that they're using that $2.35 base year in this conversion column all the way down. The price level in 1942 was 16, so that's this price level right here. The price level in 1921 was 18, price level in 1955 was 27, and price level in 1922 was 17. So what they're doing here is they're taking these things from 1942, 1921, 1955, and 1922, and they're taking the prices at that time and adjusting them to what the prices would be in 2015 dollars, and then comparing that to what the actual 2015 price is. So again, this is your year. We have our products over here. This is the price that those products were in that year. This is the math that they did to make a conversion from that year's prices to 2015 prices. This is the adjustment, so what the conversion equals. This is just this right here solved. And then this last column is the actual price in 2015. And whenever we adjust the prices like this, it allows us to kind of make comparisons on prices of, what they were then versus now. So from the table that we're looking at here, it looks like Coca-Cola and also Hershey's bars have had, price changes about on par with inflation. You can see that this is what the price was in the base, or the, year that we were looking at, so 1942 or 1921. This is what the actual price was in 2015, and this is if we adjusted those prices to 2015 prices. They're pretty close. Now, when we're looking at McDonald's hamburgers and Oreo cookies, you can see that these have gone down in real-time prices. So hamburgers from McDonald's, Oreo cookies, these were the prices in 1955 and 1922. This is what the actual price is today, and this is what those prices would be if we just took what we knew about those older years and adjusted it with the base year of 2015. So you can see that $1.31 is much higher than 89 cents that it actually does cost today. And $4.42 is obviously much higher than $2.99 actual price today. So what that means is that McDonald's hamburgers and Oreo cookies have actually gone down in real prices over time, while the Hershey's bars and Coca-Cola have been about on par with what we'd expect with inflation. Now, you probably have heard someone in your life say the phrase, back in my day, everything was cheaper. And nominally, this is true. If we're just looking at, nominal prices, and the price in 1942 was 5 cents, the price today is 63 cents. But do we think that that's necessarily true in real terms? So do you think that things were really, in real terms with adjustments for inflation, were they actually cheaper than they are now? So think about that for a second. Just, simple yes or no. Tell me, do you think that the whole back in my day, everything was cheaper is actually really true in terms of adjustments for inflation? Or do you think it's only nominally true in terms of the price itself? So I see an answer came in. Eric said nominally, and that is 100% correct. These changes and things being cheaper back in the day, it's only nominally true. So very good job. I see Pew kind of commented some stuff in there too. So it's only nominally true because yes, in physical prices, 5 cents is obviously cheaper than 63 cents. But when we adjust that 1942 price to 2015 dollars, you can see that Coca-Cola is actually cheaper today on the real adjustments than it was back in 1942. So keep that in mind, that nominal increases don't necessarily mean that there was also a real increase. So very good job. Thank you guys for your comments. Now there are some concerns about the accuracy of the consumer price index. So I'm going to go ahead and pop these up. The three possible reasons that people might be concerned that the consumer price index overstates true inflation, which is called an upward bias, come from basically three main places. One is the substitution bias, two is changes in quality, and three is new products and locations. So the substitution bias, we're going to talk about that first. This is basically that if the price of popcorn increases, for example, a consumer might substitute a less expensive snack for popcorn. If the market basket doesn't really account for that shift in popcorn to something else, the CPI would exaggerate the overall impact of the price increase, which would cause an upward bias. So what that means is if popcorn is included in that CPI basket and popcorn prices go up, typically what somebody's going to do is if popcorn suddenly becomes expensive, you'll just buy chips or M&Ms or something else. Now, what the CPI would think if they didn't adjust for that shift in substitution, they would say, oh, wow, now that popcorn is expensive, it's going to really take up a lot of the consumer's income. And that's not necessarily true, so that would create an upward bias, and it would think that inflation was getting a lot higher. So some people don't really realize that the Bureau of Labor Statistics makes these adjustments, and some people will incorrectly criticize CPI adjustments as overstating the true rise in inflation. But what they don't realize is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is actually accounting for and adjusting whenever you stop buying popcorn and start buying something else. They're not just assuming that it's a static basket of goods that is going to sit there and not change over time. They're assuming that it's dynamic and that it's constantly going to be changing, and they are accounting for that. The CPI is not necessarily a perfect measure, but they do a really good job of attempting to adjust for substitution. And the model that they use is very respected by statisticians. So just keep that in mind. Quality changes. This is the second reason that people might be concerned about the accuracy of the consumer price index. So the price may rise because the quality of a good is just better. So the example they give here is early 1990s tube TVs versus the flat screen HD TVs that we have now. And since 1999, the BLS has used a very careful adjustment method to account for these quality changes. So if we didn't account for quality changes, an increase in CPI would appear to be an increase in the price of the same good, when in reality, there's actually a change in the good itself. So it's like saying going from a tube TV to a flat screen TV. But once again, a lot of people will falsely believe that we're not actually accounting for these changes. And while the adjustments are probably never going to be perfect, they essentially use a widely accepted method, and it significantly reduced the bias in the CPI quality adjustments. So overall, people that kind of know what they're doing when they're looking at these statistics, the CPI, and making assumptions. Most people do know the CPI is a really good measure, but these are just some reasons why people might assume it's not a good measure, and kind of just confirmation that that's not necessarily true, that the BLS does adjust for a lot of these things. So the last one, or the last kind of reason that people might have concerns about the CPI accuracy is the new goods, services, and locations. So as new things come out, they say flash drives and iPads. I don't think flash drives are actually very new at this point. But previously, the BLS would update our consumer price index after long delays, and this would give us an upward bias for two reasons. One reason is that new product prices would often drop after a couple of years, and new retail outlets like online stores, marketplaces, things like that, were able to offer better prices than traditional retail stores. So in order to keep track of these price drops, in 2000, a new chain CPI was instituted. This one is more difficult to measure, but we don't currently base our reports on the new chain CPI just yet. So chain CPI, it's basically a better indicator of inflation, but it is more difficult to measure, so it's not very widely used yet. But we won't really get into really the mechanics of that. Really, I'm just concerned with you understanding basic CPI because that's what we use. I just want you to know that chain CPI is something that exists, and it's really just to adjust for this kind of new goods and new places that are offering these goods. So the cost of inflation, we're going to talk about that here in just a few slides. But let me pop this slide up for you, and then we'll talk about it. So future price level uncertainty is a big cost of inflation. So inflation causes a lot of uncertainty about the price level. And the reason being is that firms often are going to make long-term agreements that involve paying salaries, paying loans, paying for capital goods, things like that. And the uncertainty of where the price level is going to go makes these contracts a lot riskier. So workers fear whenever you go and get a job and you're signing a contract and agreeing to a wage, you might fear that you're going to be underpaid next year. Lenders that are giving out loans and things like that, they're going to be a little bit leery to give out money today because they might be getting back less valuable dollars in the next year. And we'll talk about kind of more in depth why that is here in just a minute. But if long-term contracts don't transpire, it's going to slow our GDP growth. So we have to find a way to kind of get around these fears. Now, an example, let's say, suppose you own a coffee shop. Before you're even able to sell a single cup of coffee, you obviously are going to have to spend money on resources. You're going to have to buy capital goods. So that would be things like the espresso bar, tables, chairs, a cash register, all of these things. You're going to have to hire workers and give them some assurances that they're going to be paid someday. The key for this discussion is that if you're ever going to produce your output, which is coffee, the first thing you're going to have to do is spend resources. And that can be true with any business that you're trying to open. Now, on the other end, lenders are typically going to be banks. We all know that if you want to get a loan, you typically go to the bank. When you're opening a business, you might have to borrow money for large capital equipment and pay that loan money back. So inflation is very bad for the lender, which is the bank. If we don't account for inflation in the loan contract, it's going to decrease the real value the bank receives in return. And the reason is because money today is not worth the same as money in 10 years, right? If you take out a loan for something today for $10,000, you make an agreement, you have, you're going to pay it back, whatever. $10,000 today is not worth as much as the same $10,000 10 years from now. If there's a lot of uncertainty over inflation and the potential for large increases, it's going to make the bank a lot less likely to make a larger long-term loan. Now, how do you guys think that banks kind of combat this? And what is built into a loan that makes it worth it for banks to lend, even though inflation is something that happens? Do you just pay back the exact amount of $10,000 if you get a $10,000 loan? Or is there something else that you're paying that sweetens the deal for banks? So what do you guys think about that one? Interest, very good. So I see Eric and Mario both said, and Jessica, that interest rate. So this is why banks are willing to make loans, right? If I'm a banker and I'm making a loan for $10,000, even though I know inflation's going to happen and the $10,000 that I'm going to get paid back isn't worth exactly the same as the $10,000 would be in 5 years, interest rates and interest prices allow me to make some money and to make it worth my while and kind of account for inflation. So whenever you're paying interest, one, you're kind of securing your loan and giving the bank, the idea that you have a little bit of skin in the game. You're going to give them something for their money, but you're also paying for the inflation that's going to happen between the time that you originate your loan and the time that your loan matures. So wonderful. Interest is that kind of leveler there. This is figure 8.5, and it's just kind of showing you the difference in a traditional CPI method and the new chain CPI method. So you can see that with the new chain CPI, the overall inflation levels are a little bit lower. There's less of an upward bias than that traditional CPI. But again, we're still using this traditional number. This new chain CPI number is something that we're still kind of working on perfecting. So it's not as widely accepted as that traditional CPI number is. Now, we're not going to watch the clip, but we are going to talk about the notes here. This clip talks about pennies, inflation, and copper and things like that. And it talks about how with inflation, currency is losing real value. And what that means is that the given amount of currency that we have today won't be able to buy as many goods and services tomorrow. And the question that they ask here, which is a question a lot of economists ask, it's talked about in a lot of economics textbooks, in Freakonomics, the podcast, in a lot of different economics books, is should we make small denominations of currency go away? Are these small denominations of currency not worth having anymore? And are we just wasting our resources by minting currency? So that's the question I want to ask you guys and just kind of get your opinion. There's not really a right or wrong answer here. But should we get away or, do away with things like change, like loose change, like pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, whatever, and also smaller denominations like dollar bills or $5 bills, things like that? So think about it for a second and go ahead and let me know. Do you think that it's not really worth it to have small denominations of currency in circulation? Do you think that that's something that should be phased out? And if you do think it should be phased out, what do you think is a good way to phase out smaller denominations of currency? So let me know. I'll give you guys a minute or two to write some answers, and then we'll talk about what your comments are. So Jessica said she thinks it would be difficult to phase out smaller denominations of currency. And that is probably one of the main reasons why we haven't actually seriously considered phasing out smaller denominations. A couple of economists have written sort of like opinion pieces on this and kind of given their, 2 cents about how they thought would be the best way to do this. And one of the things they talked about doing was having somewhat of a lottery. So they were saying that you would take dollar bills and, every currency, like denomination, a dollar, fives, whatever, they have these serial numbers. And they said that maybe they could just do a lottery and randomly draw serial numbers. And, rather than being a good thing, if they drew that serial number, those bills would no longer be worth anything. So it would be very random. But obviously, if you had cash and then somebody did a lottery and determined that your cash was now worthless, you wouldn't be very happy. People would not be happy if money that they had was now worth nothing. And it would be very difficult to kind of get all of those small denominations out of circulation without excuse me, rendering someone's currency worthless. So Jessica also said, I'm going to go ahead and pop this up on the screen because it's a really good comment, that a lot of times it's the small denominations that will attract sales. So it's more appealing to buy something for $2.99 instead of $3, and that is 100% true. People really like the idea of getting a good deal, and people like the idea of, being able to trust that as long as you have money, it's going to be worth something. So yes, it might be a waste of resources to mint small denominations of currency, but it would be very difficult to kind of put a deadline or a lifespan on dollar bills or $5 bills and to kind of let people know, listen, your money's not going to be worth anything pretty soon. So we don't want to do that. Now, some more costs of inflation. Inflation, we also have things called shoe leather costs and the money illusion. So let me go ahead and pop this slide up. So what shoe leather costs are, money becomes more costly to hold when prices rise because money will be worth less tomorrow than it is today. So people are going to spend resources trying to use that money today instead of tomorrow. And the reason that they call it shoe leather costs is because people would have to replace their shoes from walking to the bank so much. Today, these type of costs are going to include multiple bank or ATM visits. So the idea here is that if you start to think, oh no, like my $10,000 today isn't worth as much as $10,000 tomorrow would be, you're going to go out and you're going to spend money just to kind of quell that fear that you don't want your money to be worth less whenever inflation happens. Now, the money illusion, this is a really interesting one, and this is probably the one that affects you guys more directly. If the price of a movie goes up 10%, but our wages and all other prices go up the same amount, we have to conclude that it's the real terms of trade that have stayed the same. So this is kind of like the same as why the cheaper back in my day statement isn't really true, because many people are going to conclude mistakenly that movies have become more expensive. And what they're saying here is that if the price of a movie goes up, but also wages go up about the same, that means that the price of movies hasn't really changed. Inflation has just happened, and wages and movie prices have both accounted for that inflation change. Now, they're going to treat this change in relative price rather than like a real change. And maybe you go see fewer movies or you make other decisions based on this new price. And this is called the money illusion. Now, this is also an illusion that happens with wages the other direction. So if you have a nominal wage change, you're going to typically, a lot of people will misinterpret these nominal changes as real changes. What that's saying is like, let's say that you get a 2% raise. Whenever you see that your salary has now gone up 2%, in your mind, it feels like you got a real raise, right? But if inflation has gone up more than 2% or even by 2%, you actually have no real change in your purchasing power. And you think that you're richer, but this is just a money illusion. You don't actually have any more money than you did before your 2% raise. Your wages have just adjusted with inflation. So this is the money illusion, and this is something you definitely need to be careful about. Now, I realize most people aren't going out and calculating what the inflation rates were or the changes in inflation every time they get a raise. But, you should, if you think it's about time for you to get a raise and it's something you're going to be negotiating, go and take a look at the inflation changes from the year previous to the current year. And you can Google this. You don't have to just calculate it yourself. But go ahead and search, what was the percent change in inflation from 2019 to 2020 or 2018 to 2019? And make sure that you account for that when you're asking for a raise and get more than that percentage. That way you're getting an actual real change in your purchasing power, and it's better for you in the long run. So just a little word of advice there. So we have the cost of inflation, the nominal wage versus the real wage. Again, the nominal wage is the wage in current dollars. This is what you're actually seeing on a piece of paper. The real wage takes your wage that's on a piece of paper and adjusts it for inflation to make sure that there's actually been a real change. Another money illusion example they give here is that if nominal wages increase by 3%, but prices go up by 5% or inflation goes up by 5%, the money illusion would make you think you got wealthier, but in reality, your wages have actually decreased. So remember, nominal is always going to be that number that's written down right in front of us. But real is going to be that inflation-adjusted number. So we always want to make sure that this real wage is going up, not just the nominal wage, Because in this case of this example, if your wage went up by 3%, but prices and inflation went up by 5%, your buying power and your real wages has actually decreased. So this is a really important takeaway for your future wage negotiations. Make sure that you're getting a real wage change, not just a nominal wage change. So here's the practice what you know. Suppose that prices and wages both double next year. What is true about next year compared to this year? So remember, prices and wages are both doubling. I was just going to get on. So Eric said D at first, which D was a little bit of a tricky answer there, but A was correct. So very good. And remember, there is really I just want you guys to answer. It's okay if you get these wrong sometimes. Obviously, Eric caught himself. He was wrong for a second. So he was correct and figured out that it was A. Nominal wages would be higher and real wages would remain constant. But don't be scared to answer on here. You guys are doing so well. And even if you do happen to get a problem wrong, it just creates an opportunity for us to talk about why that particular answer isn't correct. So great job, Eric. It is A. Because real wages and because prices and wages both doubled, our nominal wage on paper is obviously a bigger number than it was before, but real wages are going to be the same. If the price had, tripled instead of doubled, then the answer would have been D and real wages would have decreased. So very good. That correct answer is A. Great job, Eric. Here's another practice what you know. If Felix gets a 1% raise this year, but prices also rise by 1%, Felix feels richer because of his raise and changes his spending habits. What is he suffering from? You guys are very quick on the draw. Yes, he is suffering from money illusion. So great job. This is when people consider nominal changes, but don't look at those real changes. Don't be someone that suffers from money illusion. Make sure that you're trying to figure out what that real wage change was. Now, another cost of inflation is going to be menu costs. So these are the tangible costs to firms for changing their prices. For example, if Walmart wants to increase their prices, they have to reprint all of their price labels. This is going to use capital and other inputs, and it's going to use more labor hours to replace the price tags. So the cost to Walmart of the paper, the ink, the rental costs of the printing machines and workers, these are all menu costs. Think of this as if you owned a restaurant. If you decided that you wanted to raise your prices, you would have to print all new menus, right? So that's why it's called menu costs, because this is why it's you have to make sure that the increase in price is worth the also increase in costs of labor, capital, things like that, to update your prices to say what your new prices are. Another kind of effect of inflation is this uncertainty about future price levels. So in a normal production process, funds must be spent today and then repaid in the future after the output sells. But for this sequence of events to occur, businesses have to make promises to deliver payments, including payments to workers in the form of wages and payments to lenders. Two types of long-term agreements are going to form the foundation of production, and this is wage and loan contracts. We've talked about these a little bit already. Both of these involve agreements for dollars to be delivered in future periods. So firms have to borrow today and pay the money back later. And we have to kind of consider that there is an inflation risk in making these contracts. So if the price level is not accurately predicted, this can impose costs on lenders or borrowers depending on the direction and magnitude of the inflation or deflation. Now, what that means is, in current terms, if we want to talk about what's currently happening in the world, if deflation occurs and you currently have a car loan that you're going to pay off pretty soon, that car loan interest rate isn't going to change. But because deflation is occurring, you're actually going to end up getting a better deal on that car than you thought you were from the bank. And the bank is actually getting a worse deal because of deflation, because you're not paying back as much as what they possibly could have gotten out of you. So not that we know that deflation is like, for sure set in stone going to happen. Deflation is typically going to be hard on the lender and good for the borrower, and vice versa. Inflation is going to be good for the lender, hard on the borrower, that kind of thing. So this little graphic here just kind of shows you inflation and long-term agreements that we have to kind of prepare to produce, and then sell. This is obviously like our business model here. Today, we're going to have to borrow money to build capital goods and hire workers. We're going to produce. And then once we sell, we're going to have to repay those loans and pay our workers. The real value of the future dollars really depends on inflation. The future periods might have lower real values of money if inflation occurs. This is going to hurt workers and lenders and make those parties incur risk whenever they agree on this long-term monetary agreement. So whether workers and lenders or borrowers are hurt really depends on whether the price level rises or falls unexpectedly. It's really important to understand here that we're making these agreements before we really know the answers. Wealth redistribution is another cost of inflation. So if inflation unexpectedly rises during the 5 years of your note, you are better off and the bank is worse off. So I was a little bit backwards earlier. I didn't mean to, I think I might have misspoke earlier whenever I said that if deflation occurs, you are going to be worse off, the bank is going to be better off. If the inflation was expected, the bank knew what was going to happen. They had required, what the loan should have been. Now, if unexpected deflation occurs, you are worse off and the bank is better off. So I apologize if I misspoke earlier in the video, but deflation makes you worse off and the bank better off. And the reason being, they calculated your loan term based on, a period of 10 years, whatever, and calculated inflation based on that 10 years, assuming that inflation would continue to rise. If deflation occurs, you're now paying more than what they initially, expected inflation to have happened because deflation occurred. So you're worse off, the bank is better off. So again, I misspoke on that. And surprises are typically rare. I don't believe that we'll have significant deflation, but it's something that could happen. But again, inflation will likely kind of level that out on the other end. Here's a practice what you know. In 2012, one takes out a 30-year bank mortgage loan with a fixed interest rate. Fixed interest rate means that the interest rate is not changing as the loan goes on. So in 2014 to 2018, inflation is very high. Who is helped and who is hurt by an unexpected increase in inflation? And they say ceteris paribus, which just means all of the things held constant. So I'll give you guys a second. Remember, unexpected inflation is good for you, bad for the bank. Deflation is bad for you, good for the bank. You guys are so quick. The correct answer is A. One is helped and the bank is hurt. So we're running a little short on time here, but we're getting close. We're on slide 31 and we only have 39. So bear with me. We're almost there. Price confusion is another cost of inflation. So if a business owner misreads the signal from a price increase, there could be a lot of trouble. So the idea here is what happens if you build a new factory or hire new workers whenever the cost of a price increases inflation? And what happens is you're going to spend a lot of time, money, and effort, perhaps to only see the new business fail. So whenever a price increase occurs, we have to ask ourselves, is it because of an increase in demand or is it because of an increase in inflation? If it's because of an increase in demand, we might need to buy new resources, hire more workers, etc., to increase output. But if it's just because of inflation, we don't want to change our output. We don't want to buy new factories, things like that. So it's really important to try to understand why this price increase is happening, but it is something that is a little bit difficult to understand, especially for business owners. Tax distortions are another thing. So capital gains taxes are taxes on the gains that are realized by selling an asset for more than the original purchase price. The problem here is that often the price rises because of inflation, not because the good that you're selling is suddenly worth more than it was a couple years ago. So think about that. If you bought a machine and somehow you're able to sell that machine for more than what it's typically worth at the time, that increase in the price is really only because of inflation. but you're still going to have to pay some capital gains tax. So that can cause some distortions there. Now, here's an example they give you. You buy a house in 1980 for $80,000, and you sell that house in 2012 for $230,000. The capital gain here is $150,000, so that's the difference in the 2012 selling price and your 1980 purchase price. But you're going to have to pay this $150,000, like there's tax on that gain. The CPI rose from 80 to 230 in those years, so the real value of your house actually hasn't changed at all, but you're still required to pay a pretty significant tax on that gain. So the amount of the tax is going to be determined by inflation and not really by tax laws. If there was no inflation, you actually wouldn't have owed any tax. So that's kind of an example of how increases in inflation can cause these distortions in taxes, and you're paying a tax on $150,000 capital gain, when in reality, the value of your home hasn't changed at all. This is just a good graphic to use for your homework or exam. It just kind of simplifies everything that we've talked about with the name of what it is, a cost of what happens with inflation and what happens with that cost. And I would definitely just kind of earmark this slide. It's slide 34. And that's going to be a good help with you for your assignments and your exams. Eric said, if only the government was wiser about spending. That's true, but Democrat, Republican, whatever it may be, I don't think that they're ever going to get incredibly wise, because for some reason, we just don't make great choices. Now, the cause of inflation, there's no debate about what the cause of inflation is. This is from Expansions in the Nation's Money Supply. Milton Friedman, who was an economist, said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's something that happens. However, not all prices that are increased are caused by inflation. When the relative price of just one good rises, sometimes people are going to call that inflation, but that's not true. Inflation has to be a continued rise in the general price level. So this definition helps us look more long-term. The cause of inflation is when a nation's money supply increases too quickly. When the money supply grows relative to the quantity of goods and services, it's going to take more money to buy a particular good and service. The more money that we print, money now becomes less valuable, and we have inflation. So there's really no argument here between economists or anyone in the world. We know this is why inflation occurs. The equation of exchange, this is one more important thing to go ahead and write down here. This is the long-term relationship between the price level and the quantity of money. What these letters mean: M is the quantity of money, V is the velocity of money, P is the price level, and Y is the real GDP. So the right-hand side of the equation, P times Y, this is our nominal GDP number. Remember, price times the price level times the real GDP. The velocity of money, this is going to be the number of times that a unit of money exchanges hands in a given year. So this is the speed of how currency circulates. And I see Eric said, worthless money, how oxymoronic. That's true. We print this money and it becomes worthless. So it's kind of ironic there. The quantity of money is going to include paper, currency, and coins. We'll talk about that kind of definition of what money is more precisely in our coming chapters. But money is going to include whatever we exchange for goods and services. And for this reason, the equation is it's actually just an identity. It's just true by definition. So the quantity of money times how fast that money is circulating is equal to the price level times that real GDP. So in growth rates, this formula looks a little crazy, but it's just things that we've already covered before. I'm going to go ahead and plot this whole slide up so you can see it while we're talking about it. But with a few math tricks, we can use this equation of exchange to arrive at a formula in terms of growth rates. So over here, this percent change in the quantity of money plus the percent change in the velocity of money is equal to the percent change in the price level plus the percent change in the real GDP. The triangle, remember, always just represents the word change. The percent sign next to the triangle just means percent change. And assuming a constant velocity of money, so we're saying the velocity of money is not changing, these are three assumptions that we can make. Now, these look crazy, but I would go ahead and just make a note because these are actually really easy kind of sentiments and they'll help you a lot on your exam. But this first one here is telling us that if inflation is greater than 0, the growth rate of the money supply is greater than the growth rate of real GDP. So that means that inflation is occurring. If inflation is less than 0, then it's telling us that the growth rate of the money supply is less than the growth rate of the real GDP. So that's deflation. This bottom one, if inflation is equal to 0, or if the price level changes are equal to 0, the money supply changes are equal to the changes of the rate of real GDP. So this is just saying this, this percent change in the price level is inflation. So these three statements are just telling you if inflation is greater than, less than, or equal to 0. And then it's telling you where the money supply is and how that money supply is changing relative to changes in the real GDP. So definitely make a note of that. Make sure that you understand how to read this. Obviously, it looks very crazy and complicated. It's really not. It's just that economists love to add as many, symbols and letters in here that we can. Now, comparing dollar values over time, this is the formula that we can use. The price level today is equal to the price from an earlier time than today times the price level today divided by the earlier price level. This just allows us to transform past prices into today's prices. We can do this easy conversion to compare, say, like the presidential salary of Abraham Lincoln compared to Barack Obama. And it just gives you a better idea than just the nominal prices themselves. So it's a pretty easy formula. We've already done it a couple times. But all you're really doing here is kind of plug and play, right? As long as you know where to put things, just make sure that you have your earlier year, today's year, and the earlier year in the right spots. So to kind of wrap things up, the CPI is the foundation of inflation calculations. This computation can be a little bit difficult because our typical basket of goods is going to change over time. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics, they account for these changes. The macroeconomic costs of inflation are things like future price level uncertainty, signal extraction problems, menu costs, the money illusion. We talked about all of these things. And we know that inflation is caused by and controlled by expansions of the nation's money supply. So I know that this chapter is kind of a lot to take in. It looks like a lot of math, but I promise you the math is not that bad. But absolutely, if you have any questions or anything like that, go ahead and type those now and I'll answer them. If you come up with some questions you have later, please email me or put those in that Q&A discussion box. And I will be sending out those check-in emails. So even if everything's going wonderful for you, please just email me back to let me know that everything's wonderful and that you're okay. Because I want to make sure that everyone is doing all right in this class. Again, if you need help with registration, let me know. But if you don't have any questions, feel free to hop off. I'll stay on for a couple more minutes to see if any questions come through and answer those. And then I'll go ahead and post this video as soon as we log off here. So thank you guys again. I really appreciate your participation. You guys are a really great class. I look forward to our Tuesday and Thursday lecture time. So I hope that you guys look forward to it as well. So a reduction in the money supply would cause deflation to happen. We have Eric's question that popped up over here. I'll go ahead and show it for you guys. Oh, nope, not that one. Sorry, it hasn't popped up on my end yet over here. But Eric asks, would a reduction in the money supply start deflation? Yes, it would. It would be very hard to cause a big enough reduction in the money supply to start deflation. There's the right comment. So they would, physically have to take a lot of currency out of circulation. And that's really hard because when you think about currency in circulation, that includes everything. So that's money that people have in coffee cans, stuffed in their mattress, buried in their backyard, like in their car, all of these different things. And the level of money that they would have to pull out of the money supply to actually trigger deflation is not super realistic. But if in theory they did pull money at a certain level out of the money supply, this would cause deflation to happen rather than inflation. So wonderful question. Anybody else have any questions here? Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to go ahead and get off of here. Again, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you guys and your comments, and I hope that you're all doing well. And if you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. Even if it's not something directly related to our class, I still might be able to help you. You never know. So let me know, and I will see you guys on Thursday. So thank you again. This link will be available in the week 4 folder. If you have any questions, send me an email or a text. Have a good week.